My name is Tracy Marshall and I'm the Executive Director of Belfast Exposed, and I've been in this post for 6 months. My background is primarily in business development, income generation and fundraising, and I've mostly worked in the third sector for most of this time. I found when I came to Belfast Exposed that there was a large pot of funding from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation that had very set objectives and outcomes that weren't being met entirely as I felt they should be. This created a situation where I felt I needed to go back to basics and analyse the foundation and their objectives, their initial criteria for choosing us, and also everything we were doing to meet those. The Paul Hamlyn funding funded 3 projects. How We Learn, which is a schools and education-based project, primarily about outreach. Then we had a project that was visual storytelling, and it's still running and it's going very successfully. However, a third project, which was based in our outreach work in communities, wasn't working in the way it should. What happened was we had chosen an area to focus on, which was somewhere we already worked and had worked for 10 years. I felt that this wasn't giving us an opportunity to explore new targets, new audiences, and to develop our work in other ways. Our third project, which we named the Dunmurry Hub, was aimed primarily at having a longer term and more sustainable impact in the Dunmurry community. Unfortunately, from the work already undertaken, I discovered from my own assessment and my own experience that this wasn't necessarily going to be the impact we had. We'd worked a large extent in this community before, and there hadn't been the impact over this period of time that we should have achieved. I felt our resources and those of Paul Hamlyn would be better placed working on a wider expansion of communities, looking at new audiences, looking at new areas, and also communicating with Dunmurry and our learning and taking it elsewhere. As a result, this project had a large degree of learning for the organisation. Having my own experience working in the voluntary sector, I knew that the outcomes for this project could be much larger and have a greater impact for us and for the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. Where the difficulty was transmitting this learning and this understanding of what we could do to the rest of the staff who had worked so diligently on the projects for 2 years. They were frustrated the project hadn't turned out the way they wanted it to, and they could see from what I was saying how I could translate this into the outcomes they felt they could achieve. What was difficult was that we then had to communicate this to Dunmurry. Dunmurry were very disappointed that we hadn't already progressed the project as far as we could. What I did was I analysed the existing project. There were 3 various versions of strategies that had been created around this Dunmurry Hub. I tore them all back to shreds and said, let's take this back, skin it all the way back and see what the basis of this idea was. I had to also impart this learning to Dunmurry. They felt they had been let down by the organisation, and they felt that they had contributed a lot to the development of the strategies, and at that point were owed some part of the hub to happen. What I have found from going back through all of these strategies with the staff here is that the basic idea is very firm and very solid. It's about sustainable impacts in communities. But what has happened is that that one community is not quite right for us to invest 3 years of our work in. The result is we've redrawn the plan. We've looked at where we have left out areas of our work. So for example, other communities, particularly in areas where there are young people. We've also looked at our own archive, which hadn't been included in any of the products produced or any of the strategies. We're going to incorporate that into our new proposal. We haven't left Dunmurry out completely. We're going to include them in a pod-like project, which is a smaller version of what our original intention was, but they're still part of it, and they're still a key part of the partnership. But what we are going to do is we've redrawn the plan and we've split it into developing new community partnerships, and also working with charities and other voluntary sector organisations who we haven't previously looked at before. This isn't just about working in one community and making one big impact, it's about working in lots of communities and having a greater impact over a larger variety. We have created a photographic pod as opposed to a hub. The hub meaning a physical entity in one particular place. The pod allows us to have an entity in a selection of places. It's also transferable and will have a life after the Paul Hamlyn funding. What is also important for us is that we've incorporated our archive into this. A large part of what Belfast Exposed is based in the photographs that were taken in the community from 1980s onwards. We haven't used these, and we feel that what we can do with each community is to develop their own archive with them, look at where they were the last time we worked with them or the first time we worked with them, look at how their community has changed, take these images of the troubled past to young people and show them how not to perform again, how not to act again, and how not to take us back, and use these images to actually develop community projects that are going to take that community forward, or keep them moving forward, or enhance the development they've done already. What I've also found in relation to this project specifically is that there was a welcome for this change, and the fact that I had a new fresh approach. The people working on this project were very frustrated by how it had become quite stagnant and how it had been neglected into the third year of a 3-year funding pot. They welcomed that change. However, on the other two projects, which are much more artistically based, my objective on artistic or non-artistic viewpoint was regarded with not hostility, but with a reluctance to accept my suggestions without question. A large part of recording this is to record my learning from starting here in January until now, which is at the end of June. When I began this post, I took it on with the belief that the Paul Hamlyn funding was now running into its final year, and therefore it was a tick box exercise for me to oversee the last bits. It hasn't been that at all. In fact, it's been the complete reverse. I've taken on a project that wouldn't have been how I'd have designed it from the start. How, with coming from a fundraising background, I felt very much like we had completely underutilised the opportunity, and I wanted to make the best of it. As a result, I have pestered Paul Hamlyn to allow me another 6 months to run this project the way I feel it could. And what I want to do with this is show the organisation at its very best, is allow it to be what it can be with this money, and to develop the archive particularly in a way that it can be used around communities, it can be used and reactivated and brought alive again inside the gallery in a way that it hasn't been, and in a way that it wouldn't have been had I not come into this post in January. It's also interesting to note for me my other learning in terms of taking up this post, not necessarily related to Paul Hamlyn, but definitely to do with my learning as a director. Having come from, as I've said, primarily a funding background, I also worked for 18 months as a Deputy Chief Executive of the Ulster Orchestra, again another arts organisation that I had no direct artistic input into. I found that the transition from the orchestra to photographic work is actually very similar, that it's the same issues, the same funding crisis, and the same personality issues that you have to deal with. For me, the learning from the orchestra has been really important, coming to work here and to understanding how I need to respect and be very aware of the artistic elements of the organisation, and not let the resource-heavy focus dominate all of that. Difficulties in terms of the alteration in the Dunmurry Hub project. The Dunmurry Community Association have worked closely with Belfast Exposed for over 10 years. To step in as this new person coming from a background that had never worked with them before, and suddenly decide that they weren't going to work with us on a long-term basis in this project, has created quite a few difficulties internally, and difficulties in dealing with the community projects themselves. Our community coordinator has worked closely with the chairman of the board of Dunmurry, and they have a very good relationship. This has been difficult for him, and I've had to manage in a very tentative way the removal of us from a permanent place in a hub in Dunmurry, and at the same point not destroy the relationship between these two men, and also between Belfast Exposed and Dunmurry over the past. This has been difficult, but it's been manageable, and it's still ongoing. It will probably involve a little bit more intricate work, but I think it will be okay long term.
Yep.
Belfast Exposed has these two large components. What has happened is, initially in the first years, the community outreach work dominated what Belfast Exposed was. But over the years, the artistic focus developed, and the gallery expanded and became what Belfast Exposed is now known for. What has happened though is the community outreach is still as important as it was before. It's just become very stagnated and has become a small anomaly inside what the organisation regards itself as focusing on. What I want to do, and my learning from taking up this post, is understanding how important both those sides are, and how I want to turn this organisation and transform it into one that has two large components and are both equally as important. Both have separate entities, both have the same vision, however. And what I want to do is be able to provide a resource-heavy organisation that is very focused on both sides, but also is very able to manage both sides together. There's a third component to Belfast Exposed, which is something new that I've learned since I came here, and which is something the organisation has completely underutilised over the last 10 years, and that's the archive of material that was taken at the very early stages in the communities that they were based. This archive is probably one of the key parts of interest for the organisation, and one of the things that will attract tourists to us in the future. It's also probably one of the easiest things for me to find funding for, as people are very passionate about the past, and there is a nostalgia towards the Troubles and the riots and the images of them. What I'd like to do is to try and develop a separate archive space. This will create a third arm to Belfast Exposed and make the transition from community and artistic photography hopefully a little smoother, as it will be the cog that joins them both together. A large part of what I'm trying to do with the organisation, and utilising the Paul Hamlyn experience to do it, is to use the archive to develop the community work, and to be able to use some of the funding Paul Hamlyn have given to us to actually do this archive development. It won't provide the money for the archive gallery space, but it will provide the very base to start developing it and start building a potential new base of support and a case for support for it.
Yeah.
I have very simplistically described how I would like to see Belfast Exposed transform over the next few years. At the minute, we have a circle. This is the gallery, contemporary gallery. We also have a smaller circle, community engagement. I'd like this circle to equal in size and importance and status inside Belfast Exposed, so the contemporary gallery. And then interlinking them all is the archive, which will be the whole point of joining everything up together and the whole direction and focus of the organisation over the next 3 years, all in the same way, all with the same vision, all with the same goals. A large part of the learning from the Paul Hamlyn experience, and particularly from the peer review in 2014, was our understanding of what is a community partnership and what is working in the community. In Northern Ireland, a large part of community work is very focused on the sectarian issues and the political diversions that we have. What we want to do is to strip away from that and go back and look at why are we here, what do we want to do with our photography workshops, what are our photography workshops and what are the outcomes from them, and who can benefit most from those. At the minute, what we're doing is going back and researching all organisations we've worked with in the past and their vision, and how we match their vision, or how we can match their vision. What we're also doing is looking at organisations we would like to work with and we haven't in the past. We're looking at young people, issues around suicide, issues around homelessness, some elder issues, issues around Alzheimer's, dementia, and trying to work out how we can work in with them to get their vision and meet their goals, and at the same time feel that we are doing what we set out to do as a community work organisation. Like every other arts organisation, another key challenge throughout society at the minute is finances and funding. Like everyone else, we're getting our funding cut. We are having tighter reins put on us by our existing funders. We have more and more relevance to show to get the funding that we have. And there's a need to diversify and to look more at our own way of making our own money and being sustainable to a certain degree by ourselves. For an organisation like Belfast Exposed that has been so heavily reliant on their core funders, this is a real challenge, and there's a base to start on that's very low, and I'm going to have a lot of work to do to get there. It's my hope that with the Paul Hamlyn funding and the extension of an extra 6 months, that we'll be able to roll out the community aspect of our Paul Hamlyn engagement. We'll be able to incorporate it into all the contemporary gallery work that's already happened over the last 2 years with Paul Hamlyn funding, and use the basis of this to transform the organisation into a more balanced organisation with a shared focus that appreciates the social photography aspect as well as the contemporary photography and the artistic aspect, and that the organisation can be at the forefront of photography and galleries and activate its archive as part of a whole museum project in the future.